Thank you, Ceann Corla. Tarnished to listen to your spat with Deputy Doherty earlier on. I was just thinking this House must be full of bowsies. I too went to jail, along with dozens of other ordinary people, fighting a cost of living increase back in 2003. The bin charges, which are now privatised and going through the roof with vast profits being made, are one of the issues in the cost of living increases. But this morning's ERSI report is really startling and shows us that there are many, many, many thousands of more people in energy poverty than this government ever calculated for. The way you calculate energy poverty is how many people get the fuel allowance. They're looking at those who are spending more than 10% of their income on fuel, and that has risen to up to 550,000 households now living in energy poverty. So the increases that you've given, that you go on about with the increases in fuel allowance, the €200 payment, it's not even scratching the surface of what needs to be done. And really what needs to be done over the next period is not between now and the budget that you do nothing, but that you actually make an intervention, because on Saturday ordinary people again will be making an intervention by coming onto the streets in about 5 cities throughout the country to protest against the cost of living rises. So we're now seeing a huge chunk of society being hammered and no plan by this government to do anything real to address it. And that's why we believe for nearly the 200,000 extra households that don't get fuel allowance, and it's meagre, that don't benefit from any intervention or rises in the household benefit package, which hasn't risen since 2013, by the way, and there are 480,000 people who qualify for that. So you've quite a scandal on your hands and you're not doing anything to intervene to help people. So what needs to be done is that workers and people on low income who are dependent on social welfare need a pay rise to match inflation. And what's worrying is the reports from the pay talks in the public sector, and the Minister beside you will know this, are indicating that the government are only talking about below inflation increases. That won't cut mustard at all, because what workers need, what people on benefit need, is increases to match inflation. And if we don't get that, then we're just spiralling into this crisis, continuing and continuing. And €100 here, €200 there is not going to do it. And all you're doing here is saying mañana, mañana, mañana. What are you going to do today, tomorrow, before the kids go back to school in September, to alleviate the absolute struggles that people are facing? Pensioners, people on social protection, workers, families, and all of the students who also face massive costs and earn very, very little pay. So we're saying that unions need to step up to the plate, put in pay claims that match inflation, and the workers need to insist that they get that. And following on that, that'll set the benchmark that the government then have to increase social protection to match inflation as well.
Yeah, thanks, Deputy. I think listening to your contribution, somebody would be forgiven for thinking that we've done nothing at all this year. We have taken a lot of action so far this year, including an increase in the state pension, including an increase in weekly welfare payments, including an increase in the minimum wage. We're currently in negotiations with public servants about pay increases for them, and a lot of pay increases are happening in the private sector at the moment. And you mentioned students there. We've made changes to the SUSI grant, which will kick in September. So all of these things have been done, and have been done in the past couple of months, and we're working towards additional actions on budget day that will make a difference in terms of helping people with the cost of living. You mentioned the ESRI there, which is a government body, and the ESRI calculates fuel poverty or energy poverty as somebody who spends more than 10% of their after-tax income on energy. It's not the same as consistent poverty or being at risk of poverty or deprivation. It's a particular means of calculating it. But what it does show, given that about 30% of households are now experiencing fuel poverty, is that it isn't just those on the lowest incomes who can experience energy poverty. Those on middle incomes can as well. And that's why I stand over the decision of this government to introduce universal measures as well as targeted measures, because middle income people, working families, middle class people, they're feeling the pinch too. And that's why I stand over the decision of this government to bring in universal measures like taking €200 off electricity bills, as well as targeted measures like the extra €100 for people on the fuel allowance. And I think that will be the approach that we'll adopt going forward. Universal measures to help everyone, because everyone is hurting, but targeted measures to help those who are hurting most, and that is pensioners and people on welfare.
I'll just make a point, because I think that there's an impression, and it might be argued by the ministers here, that if you give people a rise in their income, that only helps to spiral inflation, but that is nonsense. There hasn't been a decent rise in income for most workers in this country for years. The ICTU reckon that over the last 2 years, workers have lost about €2,500 in their income because of inflation. Now, you can say what you like about your interventions, but what we're talking about here in this cost of living crisis is a reality. We're not making it up, and everybody feels it, and you've just outlined yourself the way middle-income earners feel it too. And middle-income earners are workers, low-income earners are workers, and they need a pay rise. And I think it's quite worrying, the reports we're hearing from the public sector pay talks, because that will set the bench for everybody. And that's why we're calling on people to really get active on this and insist that their unions put in inflation-matching pay claims. And it's not true that workers like Tesco or the ESB got inflation-matching pay claims.
Thank you, Deputy.
Over the years, it'll average out at 2 to 3 to 4% at most. So there's a real crisis on our hands here, and giving workers and people on social protection an income that will match inflation will not cause inflation.
Yeah, thanks, Deputy. I think if you look at the facts and the statistics, and the CSO produces all this data, it's not my opinion, these are just facts. For the last couple of years, up until this year, average earnings rose faster than inflation. That's true for the minimum wage, it's true for public sector pay, it's true for pay generally, that average earnings have increased faster than inflation up until this year. This year is different. We're seeing unprecedented inflation, and we're seeing prices rising faster than incomes are. And as a result of that, there does need to be a response. And part of that response is going to be bigger pay increases than had been planned in the private sector and in the public sector, and we're currently in negotiations with the public sector about that. But we shouldn't see pay increases as the only lever, as the only mechanism to deal with this problem. We can do other things too. For example, reducing the tax burden on people. For example, reducing the cost of childcare. For example, reducing the cost of public transport, like we've done. So we have to see it as a package in the round, and that's the way the government is approaching it.
Thank you very much, Tánaiste.